Alright, welcome back to the wonderful world of macroeconomics. Here are the two questions from our worksheet this week that we didn't finish, and tend to be some of the trickier stuff, especially the second question, so I promised to screencast, so here we go. First thing, graph everything. So we put on the vertical axis inflation, on the horizontal axis real GDP growth, and then we just need to know what's going on with the given information. So we've got, we need to graph these three guys, and we know this and this. So let's graph the Solow curve first. The Solow growth curve, or the potential growth rate of the economy, is 3%. It's 3%, and spending growth is at 7%, so let's graph that as a aggregate demand curve where the ingredients for growth in spending, growth in money supply, and or growth in velocity add up to 7%. For a full description of why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, or this Solow growth curve is vertical, see your textbook. The other thing we need to know is the aggregate supply curve. Here we're not given a whole lot of information, but it's safe to assume that if this economy is functioning normally, in other words, if spending is either going to GDP growth or inflation, we can assume that if 3% is going to real GDP growth, the remaining 4% is going to inflation. And if this is where the economy's inflationary expectations are, in other words, if businesses are paying workers 4% more in wages every year to cover the cost of inflation, if workers are expecting that, if interest rates that banks are charging include this 4% and the expected inflation turns out to be pretty close to what actual inflation is, then you probably would expect your aggregate supply curve to be intersecting the aggregate demand curve right at that 4%. So this is an economy that's sort of stable and in its equilibrium where it's growing at its potential, and everyone expects the prices to be 4%, to rise by 4% every year, and indeed they are. Alright, so now we turn our attention to what happens when conditions change. So this was on your worksheet, and you're being asked to graph the Solow growth rate and what happens when, especially, conditions and aggregate demand change. So the Solow growth rate, given the first aggregate demand curve here, where aggregate demand spending growth is 9% per year and inflation is at 5%, the residual is 4%. So the Solow growth rate is at 4%. This economy, again, notice all the curves are crossing at the Solow growth rate, so the economy is working at its potential. And we can note that with a 4% there. So we turn our attention to B. If there's a fall in the growth of the money supply, we know spending is going to drop. So aggregate demand is no longer going to be growing at 9%, it's going to grow by 4%, so aggregate demand will shift to the left. It'll shift to the left somewhere along the lines of, looks like a pretty drastic reduction. I'm starting at 4% up here. We know that every point on the aggregate demand curve, the inflation plus GDP has to add up, right, to 4%. So if this is 2%, this has to be 2%. Right, so actually what we're more interested in is where this aggregate demand curve, this new one, crosses the aggregate supply curve, and that looks like it's going to be sort of at this juncture over here. And we'd expect the economy to be growing. I'm just picking out a number that looks like it might be reasonable to be growing much more slowly than before, certainly not up to its potential at 4%, and probably prices will drop. This is what we'd expect when spending drops by quite a bit. But this is temporary. If you look at C, it explains how this might happen, how this temporary situation might reverse itself. So this fall in money growth lasts for many years. Eventually, in the long run, workers, business owners, and consumers all adjust their inflation expectations enough so the economy returns to the Solow growth rate. So the key here is notice that that inflation has dropped, and although in the short run prices are sticky, in the long run we'd expect that they would actually adjust. So now what begins to happen is people no longer expect 5% inflation per year, they expect something less. And if you have paid attention over here to short run aggregate supply, you know that every aggregate supply curve comes with an expected inflation. In short, aggregate supply is based on costs of production, and if wages and other prices are rising, that extra inflation yields higher costs, and your short run aggregate supply reflects that. So if aggregate supply is based on inflation and inflation expectations are dropping, we would expect that aggregate supply would reflect this in the long run, and indeed, aggregate supply in the long run, we think, will take into consideration falling prices, falling costs of production because wages and everything else are falling, and you would get, it's getting kind of busy here, but make this line as thick as possible so it's clear. The short run aggregate supply curve is now shifted to the right as inflation has dropped. And so this economy is really soft. The unemployment rate is much higher than normal since we're below our potential growth rate. And prices will fall. In fact, we'll probably end up in this situation here. We know we'll end up in this situation in the long run where aggregate supply and aggregate demand are crossing at the solo growth rate. Solo growth rate remains unchanged at 4%, but what can and does change is that inflation probably drops. That inflationary expectation shows up on this aggregate supply curve where the expected inflation is now lower. The aggregate demand curve has shifted already to that lower 4% spending growth per year. So now we're back to our solo growth rate, albeit at a different price level. That's what's known as the self-correction model of the economy theory. It is thought that if left to its devices for long enough, the economy can self-correct. But as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. We may be hanging out in recession for quite a while. Many argue it's not worth it. And now you have an application. Rewrote the question with an aggregate demand shifting the other way. So go ahead and pause if you would like. Work through the question for yourself. And the gist of it is you'll have the same solo growth rate. This question, the aggregate demand will shift to the right, and as it does, it pulls up prices. Therefore, expected inflation rises. Short run aggregate supply shifts to the left. I hope this has been helpful. Have a wonderful weekend.